Everybody good? Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, actually. My name is Naya Arbiter, and I've been a TC practitioner for the last 50 years. I spent my first 27 years in the field doing what George was talking about earlier, living on campuses. So I have a perspective of kind of the bottoms-up view and what it's like to be living on a campus for that long. Most recently, I haven't lived on campuses. We're here today to talk about succession not only for individual therapeutic communities, but also succession in a slightly more global way in terms of the field of therapeutic communities, which is what George really touched on earlier. So what's the future of individual therapy communities and what's the future of the movement? In the last 5-6 years of Carl Gustav Jung's life, he had a story that he liked to tell about the water of life, the well that produced the water of life. And he would say that the water of life started bubbling up and people came around and they loved it and it was wonderful and it was free and everybody could access it, and it was nourishing and it had all kinds of special properties. And soon the property owners and the inspectors and the licensing agencies and the contracts compliance people started coming around the water and looking at the water and measuring the water and fencing the water up. And the people were so engaged in this entire process of trying to buy the water and keep the water there, that they sort of started realizing that it wasn't the same water anymore. And the water of life bubbled down and went somewhere else and then came up again somewhere else on the planet. And this has been repeating itself over and over and over again in a variety of different ways. And that is analogous, perhaps, in some ways to the therapeutic community movement, where we have seen incredible creativity, and we have also seen, as George said this morning, dramatic erosion. Okay, so the United States therapeutic community addressed the paradigm paralysis of its time as it started. It was an integrated group of leaders with authentic relationships with each other. They made it possible to change the national narrative. In its very earliest years, Synanon, which I spent 10 years there, organized the archives, went in as a heroin addict, ended up working in research. We had a real mix of people. We had Holocaust survivors and a few Nazis. We had a lot of people who'd been blacklisted in the McCarthy era who ended up turning into really senior professors. We had addicts, criminals, gambling addicts, and many who had been incarcerated for 20 years, people of all races, families, children of the incarcerated, regular children, Ku Klux Klan, mob bosses, actors, actresses, and so forth. So the question as we move forward, one question that I have in terms of succession, can integration and inclusion be moved forward in the therapeutic community? The paradigm at the start of TCs, as George also said this morning, in the US was once an addict, always an addict. Addicts and alcoholics can't clean up together. Gambling isn't an addiction. Don't accept violent offenders because they can't grow. Addicts aren't good for their children, so don't do family work. You can't really mix races. There was also a lot of conversation in some of the early years about mixing people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, which the TC proved was really not the case. You could do that, and that there must be professionals present. And during the early years in the 50s and 60s, it was acceptable to do a lot of experiments on addicts. So we had people that were in straitjackets and people that were experimented on with LSD and all manner of different kinds of experiments, because addicts were considered to be sort of throwaway people in many regards. The therapeutic community, from one perspective, became a revolution of inclusion on a lot of different kinds of levels. The people that were marginalized were included. Again, in the early years, people were able to show up. There wasn't a fee for service. The graduates and the people, even many of the dropouts, became change agents and citizens in their own communities. And I think it's important for us to take a look at whether we're an academy-type situation or there's certain parts of our agencies, what are the paradigms that we're really shifting today? And part of succession and part of the lifeblood and part of the creativity of the revolution of inclusion is what are the paradigms that we're currently looking at shifting? Who are the people that are being left out? What new marginalized groups are we reaching out to? Rowdy this morning said, it has to do with addictions, but in a way it doesn't have to do with addiction. It has to do with transformation and growth. So one of the things that started occurring, which I believe contributed to the erosion of therapeutic communities before a lot of the community method started dropping out, was the whole issue of blaming the newcomer. And every different, in the United States, different agencies have their own vocabulary of ways in which they blame the newcomer for the newcomer somehow or another not being able to stay, not being able to engage in full recovery, not being able to stay long enough for a transformative experience, those who do have enough of a length of stay, or those, for instance, with what is happening at Amity right now, where Doug Bond, who you'll hear from later in the conference, our CEO, is looking on many, many different ways of extending the runway so that people can have a length of stay that really makes some sense. One of the big, certainly for many years, a lot of people said, don't take people that had been in prison for 5 years or longer, they can't really clean up, don't take violent offenders, so forth and so on, all of which the TCs proved they could do. So for succession, and this is not an either or, it's a rather than, where might we want to have the emphasis if TCs are going to continue with community as method, and for individual people that are taking on a therapeutic community system? The emphasis, perhaps, we might say, might be on community rather than just corporation. Many of our organizations, at least in the States, are turning into these very, very large corporations at the expense of community rather than being inclusive of community. Activism rather than just assimilation because of contract compliance issues and many other pressures, external pressures that are tied to public funding. Many therapeutic community kind of organizations have assimilated to the mainstream medical structure rather than being activists for the people that need a voice, who really need advocates. So there are a number of people that are getting lost and aren't having a voice and aren't making it into citizenship. And who are those people? You certainly saw some of that in some of the plenary this morning in terms of people who get to wait for even methadone treatment. Inclusion of populations rather than excluding those who are different. A few years ago, I had the great opportunity to visit Dianova, one of their centers in Italy, and it was an adolescent center, and I was so moved because the women that worked there had started finding some refugees, finding some boy soldiers, and including them in their therapeutic community milieu, so to speak, with great success, and it was very encouraging. Because there were kids that were on the street, they didn't have anything, so they got included. What are the narratives that we need to develop for today's story rather than yesterday's? Some of the contract compliance issues and the pressures from our governments are really fighting last year's war, or last century's war, if you will. And what are the issues that are really, really relevant today that we can address and we should be addressing? An emphasis on reconciliation and remembrance rather than just recovery. Developing policies that are for today rather than policies that are for yesterday, and community building rather than just contract compliance. From one perspective, the contract compliance has contributed to the erosion of the therapeutic community, and really in terms of developing community, it's a very, very, very low bar, but many therapeutic communities, certainly in North America, have adjusted themselves to the level of contract compliance, again at the expense of creative community building and inclusion. Another issue that we're facing in terms of good succession practices is the problem of kind of tech silos. What are the ways to use technology to build rather than destroy community? We've had all kinds of events in our own agency where, for instance, students might be in an encounter group and don't say what they really need to say and then sort of have it out on Facebook with each other, or administrators who don't ever come out of their office and they're really just doing everything in the office and not actually meeting the people that are being served, and so forth and so on. So there's some issues around that, and issues around making sure that we have social media policies that are pro-social and supportive of now and of the future. Charles Dickens, many years ago, made the point that electric communication will never be a substitute for the face of someone who, with their soul, encourages another person to be brave and true. And no matter how advanced we get and how much we use Skype or whatever, we really cannot replace that, that agricultural, wonderful growth process that happens with human contact. Be present for community. The leadership needs to develop roles. Emotion always has its roots in the unconscious. There's some quotes here about that. But we had a situation with Rod Mullen, who was just stepped down from the CEO position last year at Amity, where one of the things that he did is he was teaching bowling. So, I'm sitting in the dining room talking with some students, and they said, well, are you married? Yes. Well, who are you married to? I said, well, he's a taller than me white guy, kind of looks a little bit like an ex-cop, and they said, oh, you mean the bowling coach, because their identification that made sense to them was that he was their bowling coach, because he was taking them out and bowling. We've instituted a process as part of our succession plan where every employee that comes into the Amity Foundation and comes to work signs a community membership agreement, so they know that 4 hours a month they are going to participate in something in the community, and they're given a menu of a variety of things they can do, whether that's playing soccer or whether that's reading stories to the children or whatever. It's part of their job, they're paid for it, so they get to see the people that we are of service to, and the people that we are of service to get to meet them. There go my people, I must follow them. We need to ensure that leadership does not lose touch with the people served, create many strategies for that. And the other thing, when you're in a state on a local level with transition, with a community agency, is to beware of what we might call the predatory, hedonistic opportunists. And there's a group of people, when anything is in a state of flux and in a state of movement, whether it's a country, whether it's a non-governmental organization, whether it's a corporation, the parasites show up. A lot of people that say, gee, this organization is kind of on the move, I want a really, really big salary, but this is not a group of people that are mission-driven. And we've had some fascinating experiences with that in the last year, of people coming out of the woodwork that are not necessarily interested in the mission and not necessarily interested in the essence of community. So that's an important thing to think about when you're on a local level moving into a succession plan. It's really listen to the words but watch the feet. We need courage, and the new leadership for the TC needs to develop courage as a muscle, around every circle of truth, larger circle can grow. And how do people develop some real courage to start looking at who needs to be included, who's really left out, and the issues of our time. Certainly one of the biggest issues of our time, it has to do with the climate crisis, and how do we respond to that in our communities? How do we demonstrate to our students who are on their way to citizenship to be responsible in the face of the climate crisis, in the face of many people, certainly in California, have lost their homes. We have examples at this point all over the world. How are we going to address that particular issue and develop that particular narrative in our therapeutic communities? In our organization, we've started doing that. Again, our current management team that's up and coming, we're looking at all electric cars. We went to hybrids a few years ago, and so forth and so on, which is a good example, particularly if you've got people coming out of prison, which we do, and they all want to buy the car that was popular when they went to prison. I didn't know that in Los Angeles there were so many 1970 Cadillacs, but apparently there are. So these guys come with these gas guzzlers, and it's a whole learning situation. These are policies that we just need to think about. Food, water, pharmaceutical. A lot of our folks are at the mercy of the large industrial complexes, in the United States, certainly. So we have very bad food. It's, loaded with, chemicals and so forth and so on. People coming out of prison have a lot of illnesses. So we've developed policies for the future and for some of the issues, even issues around water, and how do we purify and clean our water on our campuses. Again, can't stress strongly enough the situation with the climate crisis. As everybody knows, tomorrow starts the 7-day climate strike all over the world. These are the kinds of things that our students can get involved in and learn a great deal about, which will make a difference for them and their families. Advice to the next generation, learn new things about community. How many ways can you develop community as method? Learn new things always. Listen. Develop listening as an art form. Develop your relationships with people that are very, very different than you are. Research, research, research. Research, research, research. Research has really dropped out of the field. We really need it now more than ever. It's something we need to pay attention to on a local and global level with the therapeutic community. Be courageous, notice the problems of our time, who's left out, and honor the fundamental circle. Howard Zinn, to be hopeful in bad times is based on the fact that human history is not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now, as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a miracle. And we have some great challenges ahead of us on local and global levels, which I think, given the younger generation that's coming up, that's really excited, we're going to be able to meet beyond our wildest expectations if we stay awake to the issues. Thank you.